106. Identify the aerial contact.
Roger, scanning now. Apache, hold your position above the river.
Sierra 2-0, confirm visual on the contacts. They're accelerating.
In every military deployment, there exists a place that is never marked on a map and never mentioned in briefings. Yet every soldier knows exactly where it is, the smoke pit. And while officially it is nothing more than a corner where troops step away to satisfy nicotine cravings, in reality, it becomes something far more significant. A quiet crossroads where exhaustion lowers defenses and the mind finally loosens its grip on discipline, allowing stories to surface that have nowhere else to go. These are not the heroic tales meant for promotion boards or the sanitized summaries written into after-action reports, but the strange, uncomfortable memories that linger long after a mission ends, stories that could raise eyebrows or trigger evaluations if spoken too loudly in the wrong place. Because the military is built on order, predictability, and control, and some experiences refuse to fit inside those boundaries. At the smoke pit, rank fades into the background, voices drop, and soldiers speak with a sincerity that carries weight precisely because there is nothing to gain from lying. And what makes these stories unsettling is not that they are dramatic, but that the men telling them are trained observers. Infantrymen, scouts, pilots, people whose lives depend on accurately identifying threats, distances, and movements. They describe encounters that occurred in combat zones, restricted training areas, or places saturated with surveillance and advanced technology. Environments where nothing should exist without explanation, and yet something did. What is shared in the smoke pit is often spoken once and never repeated, because acknowledging it too openly forces a question no one wants to answer. What if the battlefield contains more than just known enemies and known machines? These stories are traded not for validation, but for relief, a way to test the memory against another human presence, to see if speaking it aloud lessens its grip, and sometimes the listener has a story of his own, eerily similar, told in a different accent, from a different year, on a different continent. It is here that soldiers admit they were afraid, not because they were under fire, but because they were observed, tracked, or confronted by something that did not behave according to human logic. Some of these stories are dismissed as stress, fatigue, or equipment malfunction. Yet the men who tell them insist on one thing with absolute certainty, that what they experienced was real, tangible, and deeply personal. Anonymity becomes essential, not to fabricate, but to protect careers, reputations, and sanity, because the military has little room for mysteries that cannot be engaged, defeated, or classified. Over time, these accounts began circulating quietly among service members, collected by those who understood that war leaves behind more than physical scars, and that some of the most profound moments happen when no shots are fired at all. As you listen to these smoke pit stories, a pattern begins to emerge. Not proof, not answers, but consistency. Similar movements, similar lights, similar sensations of disorientation and fear, described by people who have never met each other. This chapter is not an attempt to explain or convince, but an invitation into that unspoken space where soldiers confront the limits of what they understand. Because whether these stories are believed or not, they were lived, and for the men who shared them, the smoke pit remains the only place where such memories can exist without judgment, suspended in cigarette smoke and silence, waiting for someone willing to listen. It was December of 2016 in Afghanistan when our infantry platoon finally reached observation post Manos along the Helmand River after a long, exhausting day of patrol, delayed for hours by a disabled lead vehicle and a mine roller that needed recovery. And by the time we arrived, the sun was already sinking low, casting long shadows over terrain we knew well from previous missions alongside the Afghan National Army. Yet familiarity offered no comfort that evening because earlier contact with What intelligence described as a lightly equipped Taliban unit had left everyone alert and tense. Once the shooting stopped and darkness settled in, we established security in textbook fashion, spreading out across the observation post with overlapping sectors of fire, relying on night vision and thermal optics that usually made us feel untouchable in the dark, and for a while the world narrowed to radio chatter, distant sounds of water along the river, and the quiet patience that comes from waiting on orders to return to Camp Dwyer. I remember lying back briefly, staring upward through my night vision, when one of the squad leaders suddenly shouted for everyone to look up, his voice sharp in a way that cut straight through fatigue, and within seconds every man on that hilltop was scanning the sky, searching for the object he had spotted moving above us. At first it looked like a drone, but it moved too fast, changing direction with an ease that immediately set it apart from anything we had seen before. And when the squad leader flashed his infrared strobe twice, a standard signal meant to identify friendly aircraft, the situation crossed into something none of us were prepared for because the object responded instantly, projecting powerful infrared beams straight down onto our positions, sweeping from fighting hole to fighting hole, locking onto individual soldiers with such precision that it felt deliberate, almost methodical. The beams were invisible to the naked eye, but blinding through night vision, flooding our goggles with light. And as one washed over me, I remember yelling in pure confusion, my training overridden by the raw instinct that something above us was actively observing us, not attacking, not warning, but studying. I had never seen a drone or aircraft capable of maneuvering so aggressively while also targeting individuals on the ground with pinpoint accuracy, and the fear that spread across the platoon was unlike contact with an enemy, because there was nothing to shoot at and no behavior that made tactical sense. We called for air support, and an Apache helicopter eventually came on station, with the pilot confirming that he could see the object as well, attempting to maneuver closer to it. But the moment the Apache closed the distance, the object shut off every visible and infrared light simultaneously, plunging the sky back into darkness before accelerating away at incredible speed, streaking low over the Helmand River and disappearing in seconds. Later, back at Camp Dwyer, we were debriefed by intelligence personnel who pushed the report up the chain, and when the response came back, it only deepened the unease. No friendly drones, aircraft, or surveillance platforms were operating in that area at the time, and there was no official explanation for what we had witnessed. The incident was logged, discussed quietly, and then buried beneath operational routine. But for those of us who stood on Opie Manos that night, the memory never faded because we were not engaged, warned, or threatened. We were acknowledged, illuminated, and then dismissed, as if whatever had hovered above us had simply finished its task and moved on. During my deployment near Kandahar, I learned that some of the strangest moments of war happen not during contact, but in the quiet stretches of patrol when the mountains seem frozen in time and the night vision reveals a sky that feels far too active to be empty. Because on more than one occasion, I watched lights moving above the ridgelines at speeds that immediately told me they were not aircraft built by human hands. The first time I noticed them, it was almost accidental, a casual glance upward that turned into several minutes of stunned silence as two, sometimes three, luminous objects hovered just above the mountain crest to the east, their glow steady and controlled as if they were aware of the terrain beneath them. At first I assumed it was a trick of distance or perspective, maybe helicopters far off or some classified platform we were not briefed on, but that explanation collapsed the moment the lights began to move, accelerating sideways, stopping dead without deceleration, then reversing direction in a way that ignored every law of physics I understood. And even through night vision goggles, the movement looked wrong, too smooth, too intentional. I was a team leader at the time, responsible for maintaining situational awareness, and yet I found myself standing still, weapon lowered slightly, watching something I could not categorize, because these objects were not transiting like aircraft and not drifting like flares, but dancing across the ridgeline, in deliberate patterns, crisscrossing one another before separating again, as if coordinating silently. On one occasion, someone in the platoon managed to record a video through night vision, and we watched it afterward in disbelief, knowing it was the kind of footage that would either disappear or be explained away, and unfortunately it did vanish over time, lost to broken phones, wiped drives, or simple neglect, which only added to the frustration of knowing we once had proof and could no longer produce it. I remember calling the sighting up to our company command, trying to sound professional and composed as I reported unidentified aerial lights maneuvering above the mountains. But the response was indifferent, almost dismissive, suggesting sensor anomalies or misidentification, despite the fact that multiple soldiers were observing the same thing with their own eyes. We stood there for several minutes, watching as the lights hovered, moved, and then abruptly accelerated, straight upward, vanishing into the sky without fading, without sound, and without any visible propulsion. And what struck me most was not fear, but how quickly we accepted it. Because after a brief silence, we simply resumed our patrol, stepping back into formation as if nothing extraordinary had just unfolded. Over the course of that deployment, I saw these lights at least 2 or 3 times, always near the same general area, always at night, and always behaving in ways that felt intentional, rather than random. And years later, when declassified Navy FLIR footage began circulating publicly, I felt a chill recognizing the similarities, the speed, the sudden stops, the way the object seemed unconcerned with gravity or inertia. Even now, I cannot say with certainty what those lights were, whether they were advanced technology, something misinterpreted under extreme conditions, or something else entirely. But I know what they were not, and that is the unsettling part because trained soldiers in a combat zone should not repeatedly witness aerial phenomena that defy explanation and then be expected to forget about it. These sightings did not disrupt missions or cause panic, but they left behind a quiet unease, a sense that the airspace above us was not as empty or as controlled as we were led to believe, and that whatever moved over those Kandahar mountains did so with complete indifference to our presence, as if observing us was incidental, not the purpose, and that realization lingered far longer than the deployment itself. The incident happened nearly 9 years ago when I was a junior enlisted soldier assigned to a sniper section at Fort Drum in upstate New York during a period when we were relentlessly training for the expert infantry badge and pushing ourselves far beyond normal duty hours. And one of the most common after-work routines involved running night land navigation courses in Training Area 1, a deceptively small but brutally difficult stretch of terrain roughly 2 kilometers by 1 made, miserable by deep snow, swampy ground, and dense vegetation that swallowed sound and light alike. What made this training area especially unsettling was the presence of old colonial graveyards and abandoned settlements scattered throughout the woods, many marked as off-limits but easy to stumble upon accidentally during night iterations. And by that point, I had run the course so many times I could identify most points simply by their grid location on the map. On this particular night, cloud cover was heavy, eliminating moonlight and starlight, leaving the forest wrapped in near-total darkness as I moved toward my final point at the northeast corner of the training area, successfully located the stake, punched my scorecard, and turned to move on when I heard a strange sound directly ahead of me, like something forcefully exhaling in the brush, a noise that froze me in place and triggered every internal alarm I had. When I hit the area with my red lens flashlight, I saw a fog, forming where none should have existed, thick, unnatural, and carrying a sharp, almost synthetic odor that didn't belong in a winter forest. And as I stood there following my training, stop, look, listen, smell, think, I heard the sound again, this time with a deliberate rhythm that made my mind shift from biological to mechanical. Trying to preserve my night vision, I briefly switched to white light, but the fog reflected it back harshly, making it harder to see. So I shut the light off and stepped forward cautiously, only to begin hearing faint tones and beeping sounds coming from the same direction, low and controlled, as if emitted by some unseen device. When I illuminated the area again, I realized my light was casting a shadow against the trees, not of the fog, but of something solid standing directly in front of me that I could not actually see, as though whatever it was existed behind a veil. And as I tried to move my light to understand what I was seeing, I heard a hollow thump followed instantly by a blinding flash that consumed my vision completely, accompanied by an overwhelming ringing in my ears before everything shut off in a total darkness, abrupt and absolute. When I regained awareness, I was walking on a gravel road, disoriented, nauseous, and unbearably heavy, with no memory of how I got there. And as my senses returned, I realized I was no longer in the woods at all, but standing at the southwest corner of the training area, miles from where I had. Blacked out, missing my map, with my phone dead, and only 15 minutes having passed according to my watch. Panic set in as fragmented memories returned, my head throbbed, my stomach rebelled, and I vomited on the roadside, unable to reconcile distance, time, and terrain with what I knew to be physically possible, and yet instinct carried me back to the rally point, where I turned in a perfect scorecard and was told to hydrate and rest. No one questioning my condition, unaware that something had happened to me that I could not explain, something that would follow me long after the exercise ended. Years after deployments end and uniforms are folded away, some experiences refuse to stay buried, lingering instead like unfinished conversations that resurface in quiet moments. And for many soldiers, the only place those memories ever fully existed was the smoke pit, because it is there that stories without answers are spoken without expectation of resolution. What connects the events from Afghanistan to Kandahar to a frozen training area in New York is not proof or spectacle, but consistency. The way trained professionals from different units, years, and environments describe encounters that share the same unsettling traits: impossible movement, missing time, physical disorientation, and the unmistakable feeling of being observed by something that did not announce itself as hostile yet was undeniably aware. These men did not return from war claiming glory or revelation, but confusion, carrying questions that no intelligence brief or medical evaluation could fully address. Because how? Do you explain an object that reacts intelligently to infrared signals, or lights that defy physics and vanish vertically into the sky, or an encounter in a controlled training area that leaves you miles away in minutes with no memory of travel? Skepticism offers comfort only up to a point, and while stress, fatigue, and environmental factors can explain much in combat, they cannot erase the shared details that echo across these accounts, details that surface independently yet align with disturbing precision. The smoke pit becomes a place of quiet validation, not belief but recognition, where a nod or a short, "Yeah, I saw something too," carries more weight than any formal report. And what makes these stories endure is not fear, but the absence of closure, the sense that something intersected briefly with human lives and then moved on without consequence or explanation. Some soldiers eventually convinced themselves it was advanced technology, experimental platforms, or classified systems they were never meant to know about, while others admit privately that such explanations feel incomplete because technology still follows rules, still behaves with limits, and what they encountered did not. These memories shape how they view the world long after service, making the night sky feel less empty and familiar places feel subtly watched. And yet most choose silence, not because they doubt themselves, but because speaking openly risks ridicule, career damage, or being reduced to a diagnosis that cannot explain the experience itself. The smoke pit remembers these stories because official history does not, preserving them in fragments passed from one soldier to another, not as warnings or beliefs, but as acknowledgments that war exposes people to the edges of reality, places where human understanding thins and certainty fails. Perhaps someday, these encounters will be explained, categorized, and stripped of their mystery, but until then they remain, suspended in memory, neither proven nor dismissed, existing in that uncomfortable space between what we know and what we have experienced. And for those who live them, that uncertainty is the heaviest burden of all, because some questions follow you home, sit beside you in silence, and never truly let go.